Mention the name Martin Luther, and the image is usually that of a courageous underdog, the monk who stood his ground against the corruption of the medieval church. His most significant act was the translation of the Bible into common German. It was a move that stripped power from the religious elite and returned the study of Scripture to the ordinary believer. By making theology accessible, he sparked the Protestant Reformation and changed the religious map of Europe. These shifts established Luther as the central figure of evangelical orthodoxy, a historical leader whose influence is still felt in almost every Protestant denomination today. Then we move to the night of November 9, 1938. This was Kristallnacht, an orchestrated night of state-sponsored violence and destruction directed at Jewish communities across Germany. Nazi propagandists were quick to point out a specific detail. This night of terror took place on Martin Luther's birthday. The Nazi Party worked to create a direct ideological link between Adolf Hitler's political goals and Luther's theological writings. Adolf Hitler described Luther as a giant who, quote, saw clearly that the Jews need to be destroyed, and we're only beginning to see that we need to carry this work on. The question for historians and believers alike is how the foundational figure of the Reformation became a primary ideological weapon for the Third Reich. To find the answer, we have to look back to 1523. In Wittenberg, Germany, the younger Luther was in a far more optimistic phase of his career. In his early work, Luther advocated for Christians to treat the Jewish people with kindness. He argued that the cruelty of the church was the only reason Jewish communities had refused to believe in Jesus. He hoped that by presenting a reformed version of Christianity, one stripped of medieval abuses, his Jewish neighbors would naturally find the faith attractive. At this stage, Luther saw Jewish unbelief as a theological matter for peaceful persuasion, specifically rejecting the use of force or coercion. 2 decades later, that optimism was gone. Now an elderly man, Luther was bitter that Jewish communities continued to reject his message. His frustration turned into a call for societal hostility. In 1543, he published a treatise, a formal, systematic written argument, titled On the Jews and Their Lies. This was the moment he shifted from trying to convert to trying to exclude. The document outlined a 7-point plan. He called for the burning of synagogues and the destruction of Jewish family homes. He then demanded the confiscation of holy books, the prohibition of rabbis from teaching, and the forced labor of young Jewish men and women. Luther did not invent European anti-Semitism. Prejudice had been a feature of medieval life for centuries, but his status as the architect of the Reformation changed everything. His words provided a theological foundation for hatred that gave it a new, lasting authority within Protestantism. By the 1930s, those centuries-old writings were dusted off and deployed across Germany. Nazi-sympathetic pastors quoted Luther's 7-point plan directly to provide a religious justification for state policies. They framed the persecution of Jewish citizens as a continuation of a long-standing German Christian tradition rather than a radical departure from it. This stood in direct opposition to the origins of the faith, a movement led by Jewish apostles proclaiming a Jewish Messiah. The tragedy is that a faith born to fulfill the hopes of the Jewish people was weaponized to authorize their destruction. This history is more than a look back at a man from 500 years ago. It illustrates how the voices of religious and cultural leaders shape the way a society views its minorities or violence. Words spoken by those in authority can echo for generations, and history shows us the consequences when they do.